I should never have agreed to play that thing. I was in Kyoto, visiting a Japanese friend named Hiroshi, who had always been fascinated by urban legends and horror stories. It was just an ordinary night, we were drinking, playing video games, until he suggested, "Why don't we try Kokkuri-san?" I laughed at first, thinking he was just trying to scare me. He explained it was a Japanese version of the Ouija board, but using coins and a piece of paper. It seemed harmless enough, so I agreed. Big mistake. Hiroshi set everything up on the table. He drew a sort of makeshift board with the words yes and no, along with numbers from 0 to 9 and the Japanese alphabet. In the center, he placed a 10-yen coin. The rule was simple: we'd ask questions, place our fingers on the coin, and the spirit would answer by moving it across the paper. "But you have to end the game when you're done, okay?" he warned. I laughed again, thinking he was overreacting, but I agreed. As soon as we placed our fingers on the coin and he started invoking Kokkuri-san, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift immediately. At first, it felt like a joke. We asked silly questions like, "Who's going to get married first?" or "Is it going to rain tomorrow?" The coin moved slowly but always gave coherent answers. I was about to accuse Hiroshi of pushing it on purpose to scare me when he asked a more serious question, "Kokkuri-san, are you here now?" The coin paused for a second and then slowly slid to yes. I laughed, but it came out a bit nervous. The mood no longer felt so light-hearted. Hiroshi looked at me, a bit pale, and said, "Your turn." I didn't want to ask anything too serious, so I said, "Kokkuri-san, how many people are in the room right now?" The coin stayed still for a moment, then started moving. First, it went to the number 2, which made sense, it was just me and Hiroshi. But before I could lift my fingers, it moved again and stopped on the number 3. A chill ran down my spine. Hiroshi looked visibly tense too. 3. "No, that's wrong. It must be a trick," I said, trying to stay calm. Hiroshi didn't reply, just stared at the coin like he was waiting for it to move again. I leaned back, taking my fingers off the paper, but he quickly grabbed my shoulder. "You can't leave like that. You have to end the game," he said in a low voice, almost as if he was afraid something might hear us. I sighed, a bit annoyed, but placed my fingers back on the coin. Hiroshi asked, "Kokkuri-san, who is the third person?" The coin stayed still for what felt like an eternity. That's when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was the sound of soft, bare footsteps, moving slowly. I looked at Hiroshi, expecting him to say it was just the wind or some stupid explanation, but he was pale, his eyes wide, fixed on the door. "You locked the door, right?" he asked, his voice trembling. I stood up slowly, trying not to look as terrified as I felt, and walked to the door. The lock was in place. Even so, the sound continued. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth, just outside. I went back to the table and looked at Hiroshi. "This is a joke, right? Someone's outside trying to scare us?" He just shook his head, looking more frightened than I was. "If you don't end the game properly, it won't stop," he murmured. "Fine, how do we end this?" I asked, trying to hide my panic. Hiroshi started asking the right questions. "Kokkuri-san, can we end the game?" The coin moved slowly to no. My heart sank. "Ask again," I said, almost yelling. He repeated the question, but this time the coin didn't move at all. That's when the light started flickering, and the sound of footsteps changed. It now sounded like someone, or something, was scratching at the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever it was desperately wanted to come in. I wanted to get up, run to the door, and open it just to end this, but Hiroshi grabbed me. "Don't do it," he whispered, gripping my arm tightly. "If you open it, you invite it in." The thought of something waiting on the other side, just waiting for an invitation, made my blood run cold. "Ask again, quickly," I said, staring at the coin as if it were my only salvation. Hiroshi was sweating and trembling as he asked for the third time, "Kokkuri-san, can we end the game?" This time, the coin slowly moved to yes. Before we could even breathe a sigh of relief, it began sliding across the paper on its own, forming letters. They weren't in any language I recognized, just scribbles and chaotic symbols. Then, suddenly, the coin stopped in the middle of the board, and the sound at the door ceased. The silence was deafening. Hiroshi quickly flipped the paper over, tore it up, and threw it in the trash. "We're done. Don't say anything. Don't think about it. Just leave." Since that night, Hiroshi has never mentioned the game again, and I've avoided anything remotely related to Kokkuri-san. His apartment stayed empty for months, and as far as I know, he moved to another city. As for me, even recalling this story sends shivers down my spine. If you're thinking of trying this game, do yourself a favor, don't. I never believed in ghost stories, you know. I've been living in Japan for a few years and have heard plenty of these legends, but I always thought they were just exaggerations. That changed one October night when I was driving home after visiting a friend in Hamamatsu. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and the road was completely deserted. That's not uncommon here, especially in more remote areas. I was alone, the radio was on low, and I was just trying to stay awake. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, right after a sharp curve. A young girl, maybe in her early 20s, with long hair and light-colored clothes, as if she were coming back from some event or party. I instinctively slowed down because, well, no one wants to ignore someone who seems to need help. But there was something strange about her. Even from that distance, she looked, too still, like not even the wind was touching her hair or clothes. When I stopped the car next to her, I rolled down the window and asked if she was okay. It took her a few seconds to respond, and that's when I noticed how pale her face was, almost colorless. Finally, she lifted her eyes and, in a soft voice, asked for a ride. "I'm heading home, near Kisaragi Station," she said. I found it odd because I knew the area, and I'd never heard of that station. Even so, it was late, and she seemed desperate. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let her in. As soon as she sat in the passenger seat, the air in the car seemed to change. I can't explain it well, but it got colder, like I'd turned on the AC, even though I knew it was off. She stayed silent for most of the ride, staring straight ahead with her hands resting on her lap. I tried to make small talk, asking where she was from or if someone was waiting for her, but her answers were short and vague. When I asked again about Kisaragi Station, she just murmured, "You'll see." The tension in the car was becoming unbearable. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't stop glancing at her every now and then. The thing is, each time I looked, she seemed different. At first, I thought it was just the angle or the lighting, but that wasn't it. Her face looked paler, and her hands were trembling slightly. Even her hair, which had seemed clean and neat when she got in, now looked messy, almost dirty. After a few minutes of driving, I realized something was wrong with the road. It felt like I was driving in circles. The scenery didn't change, the same trees, the same type of rusty fence. My GPS had stopped working, and the radio was just static. "Are we close?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She didn't answer. She just turned her head slowly toward me. For the first time since she got in the car, she really looked at me, and I swear, those eyes, they weren't normal. They were deep, empty, like there was nothing human behind them. At that moment, I wanted to pull over and tell her to get out, but something stopped me. It was like my muscles wouldn't respond, like I was frozen at the wheel. She kept staring at me without blinking and then smiled, a strange, unnatural smile. It wasn't a normal smile, it was too wide, too forced, as if her face wasn't made for it. "You know where we are, don't you?" she asked. Her voice sounded different now, huskier, almost echoing in the car. That's when it hit me. I didn't know where I was. I didn't recognize the road anymore, and no matter how far I drove, it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. My chest tightened, my heart was racing, but all I could think about was keeping the car moving. Suddenly, she leaned closer to me and whispered, "Don't worry. We're almost there." Man, at that moment, I thought I was going to lose it. The temperature in the car dropped even more, and the window on her side started to fog up, not from her breath, but as if something was forming there. It looked like a handprint. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. "Get out of my car now!" I yelled, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. She sat there for a moment, staring at me with that distorted smile. "It's too late," she murmured. And then, she simply vanished. It wasn't like she got out quickly, she just disappeared. 1 second, she was there. The next, the passenger seat was empty. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. The silence was deafening, and the air in the car was still freezing. When I finally worked up the courage to look around, I realized I wasn't on the same road anymore. It was a different place, a narrow road with trees so dense I could barely see the sky. My chest tightened, and I knew I had to get out of there. I restarted the car, turned in the first direction I could, and drove as fast as I dared without looking back. After driving for a few minutes, I finally saw lights ahead. It was a small village with just a few houses and streetlights illuminating what looked like the town center. I parked near a convenience store and walked in, desperate for some human interaction. The clerk, an older man, looked at me like I was crazy. I was sweaty, pale, and clearly shaken. "Are you okay?" he asked in Japanese, and I just nodded. I explained what had happened, the girl, the road, the disappearance, but he stayed silent for a while, his expression serious. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine, "You shouldn't have stopped. Many people have talked about the girl on the curve, especially near where you were. They say if she gets in your car, it's because she wants to take you to where she's trapped. You're lucky you got away alive." At that moment, I didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified. I got back in my car and drove straight home. I've never taken that road again, and to this day, I avoid traveling alone at night. I shouldn't have taken that job. When I was asked to inspect the renovation of an old bridge in Fukui, I thought it would be something simple, just routine supervision. The bridge, Tsukiji-bashi, was ancient, built over 2 centuries ago, and was being adapted for modern traffic. As soon as I arrived, I noticed the workers were acting strangely. They barely spoke to me, and when they did, they avoided looking me in the eye. I could tell they were uncomfortable, but no one would say why. On the first night, I decided to stay in the makeshift accommodation near the site. It was a converted shipping container, as is often used in projects like this. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on wood. I looked out the window and saw the bridge partially covered by scaffolding. There was no wind, and all the workers had gone home hours earlier. It was impossible for anyone to be there. I tried to ignore the noise and go back to sleep, but something about it bothered me. Even after the tapping stopped, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside the accommodation. I got up, grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The air was cold, and everything was eerily silent. I walked toward the bridge, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a loose structure making the noise. But as I got closer, I saw something that made me uneasy. In the middle of the old concrete, there was a strange mark. It looked like some kind of ideogram or carving etched into the structure. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed ancient, like it had been there since the bridge was first built. I took a photo with my phone to ask the site manager about it the next day. At that moment, I felt an odd chill and turned quickly, thinking I'd heard footsteps behind me. There was no one there. It unsettled me for the rest of the night. The next day, I showed the photo to the site manager. He glanced at it briefly and, before I could finish my sentence, shook his head. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it," he said, then walked off to check on another team. Later, as I was reviewing reports in the accommodation, one of the older workers appeared at the door. He seemed hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should say something. "Did you see anything on the bridge last night?" he asked in a low voice. I told him I'd only heard noises and seen those strange symbols. He took a deep breath, looked around nervously, and said something that chilled me to the bone. "They say there's something buried under that bridge. Something that should never have been disturbed." I asked him what he meant by something buried, but he just shook his head, as if he'd already said too much, or maybe he didn't want to scare me further with what he knew. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, while the others slept, I grabbed my laptop and began researching the bridge and its history. That's when I found it. A brief mention, buried in an old blog about Japanese folklore. The bridge had been built during the Edo period, and according to the author, it was believed that a Hitobashira had been used during its construction. I had never heard that term before. Human pillar. People were sacrificed and buried alive in structures like bridges or castles to ensure their strength and protection. It was thought their spirits would guard the construction from disasters or enemies. I felt a shiver run down my spine. If this was true, the bridge wasn't just an old structure, it was a tomb. After learning that, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. Even the wind seemed unnervingly ominous that night. The next day, I couldn't focus on work. I kept staring at the bridge, trying to imagine where the sacrifice might have taken place. The thought that someone might be buried alive there left me with a strange unease. But what unsettled me the most was that the feeling that something was wrong hadn't left since I arrived. On the third day, things got worse. During an inspection, one of the workers fell from the scaffolding. He broke his leg, and as we waited for the ambulance, he kept shouting that he had heard voices before he fell. "They were whispering my name," he repeated, his eyes wide with fear. Several of the other workers were visibly shaken, and two of them even asked to leave the site that same day. When I spoke to the manager about it, he just said accidents happen and told me to keep the project moving. That week, everything seemed to go wrong. Equipment malfunctioned, a truck delivering materials broke down, and other strange problems kept cropping up. It was like the entire project was cursed. Then it happened again that night. I heard the same knocking sound from the first night, light taps on wood. I couldn't stay in the accommodation any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the bridge, determined to figure out what was going on. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I felt like I had to see it for myself. I climbed the scaffolding and went to the spot where I'd first seen the symbols. As I examined the carving, I started to hear footsteps. They weren't coming from far away but directly beneath me, as if someone were walking on the bridge. I climbed down as quickly as I could, but when I reached the ground, no one was there. Just an oppressive silence. Before I could return to the accommodation, I heard another sound, this time from under the bridge. It was a faint voice, almost impossible to make out, but it sounded like someone crying. I stopped, straining to hear better. The old structure was full of corroded beams and supports, and the sound continued, a low murmur mixed with something that sounded like breathing. I moved closer to a section of the bridge where the concrete looked older and cracked. Then I caught a smell, stale and damp, like a basement that had been sealed for years. In the depths of one of the cracks, there was a small gap in the concrete, just large enough for me to crouch down and look inside. When I shone my flashlight into it, the smell intensified, nearly making me gag. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, a piece of metal, maybe. But then it blinked. 2 eyes. Sunken, motionless eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I froze. My body wouldn't respond. I could only hear my own rapid breathing. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a rat or a cat that had crawled in there. But when I looked again, I saw a hand, as if it were reaching out for help. Then the sound came again. It wasn't a murmur anymore. It was a low, drawn-out moan filled with pain. But it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like two voices mixed together. I bolted. I didn't look back, I didn't want to. I scrambled up the embankment back to the top of the bridge as fast as I could. When I reached the accommodation, I realized I was shaking so much it took me a minute to unlock the door. I shut everything behind me, locked it, and turned off the lights. I sat in the corner, trying to steady my breathing. I kept repeating to myself, "It's all in your head. You're just tired. That's all." But it didn't help. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I told the site manager what I had seen. I hesitated to give too many details, who would believe eyes in the darkness, but I mentioned the strange noises and the possibility of something being buried under the bridge. Some of the workers got curious, and we decided to check the spot together. When we reached the crack in the concrete, one of the more experienced workers started removing loose stones. It didn't take long for him to stop abruptly, his face pale. This is a bone," he said, holding up what looked like part of a human arm, partially preserved, embedded in the bridge's structure. That was enough for half the workers to drop their tools and back away, muttering about the Hitobashira legend. Some insisted it confirmed the stories about human sacrifices during the bridge's construction, while others thought it was just evidence of some ancient crime. Either way, no one wanted to keep working. The site manager called the police, and investigations forced the project to shut down indefinitely. I've never gone back to that bridge since. Sometimes, I still think about those eyes I saw that night, and what else might be buried there, waiting to be discovered.
If you enjoyed these stories and want to keep up with more chilling content, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll get notified whenever there are new terrifying tales to explore. Also, leave a comment with your thoughts and share with friends who love a good mystery. It really helps the channel grow and brings more scary stories for you all.